As it was mentioned, I have taken up this subject today because also in my work and whenever I meet the media or when you look into the media, you have seen now very often that the rise of the East equals the decline of the West. And that is all related, of course, primarily to China. And if you follow some of the readings also in academia, you see that point made very strongly. Now, in order to deal with this issue, I started to develop this sort of argumentaire to look at both sides of the coin, and I will try to present you a few of the issues, but I will not fall in the trap in telling you Europe is all fine. Don't worry, it's all the media which get it wrong. This is certainly not the case. So I will first deal a little bit with the situation in Europe, but then also look on the Asian side and highlight a few of the issues I think which are of concern to Asia. And if they are of concern to Asia, then they are also of concern to us, because especially in terms of economics, in trade, but also in security, we are very closely interlinked. If something is going to happen in Asia, we have repercussions very quickly also here in Europe. And we have made this experience, if you just think about 3 years ago, when there was this strong earthquake in Taiwan. About 2 or 3 weeks later, the IT technology had a problem in producing computers. Where after Fukushima, the car industry had a problem because very close to Fukushima was a Japanese factory producing parts for the whole of the Japanese industry. So there you see interconnectivity wherever you look, and therefore Asia and Europe are very much dependent on each other, whether we like it or not. But in order, and coming back to where we are, coming back to Maastricht, where I had the pleasure to be here in this room about a year ago when there was the symposium 20 years of the Treaty of Maastricht, then I think we should recall, because this is of importance in the Asia-Europe relationship, that it was the Treaty of Maastricht which formally recognized foreign policy as an area of engagement of the European Union, and also reflecting the European leaders' long-cherished ambition to advance a political union and to become jointly involved in global politics. This foreign policy pillar, however, remained under the intergovernmental remit, i.e. we need unanimity. So the pillar structure was destroyed by the Treaty of Lisbon, but as I would say, unfortunately, the intergovernmental mode was maintained. Now we have, as you know, my boss, the High Representative, we have the Action Service, and we have also now written down in the Treaty of Lisbon that the President of the European Council, as well as the President of the European Commission, can and should represent the European Union internationally. Well, that always means when we have a summit, then we have at least 2 presidents. And when you think in terms of Henry Kissinger, who asked about 30 years ago, can anybody give me the telephone number of Europe? Then the telephone numbers have been reduced. He can try now to call the 3 I mentioned, and in former times it used to be all the 27 foreign ministers, plus the representatives of the European institutions. So we are getting a little bit smaller, but we are not yet there. What we are trying to achieve right now is that we have 1 message and 28 mouses which produce the message. So that's where we are in the EES, and that's part of the ongoing development, criticism. We are now in the review process of the EES, and you see any amount of comments from think tanks, from the European Parliament. So when I would say the next 4 to 5 months, you will find quite a few comments on the development of the European External Action Service. Normally in these discussions should then lead to some reform, which we certainly need, and I guess one of the most important issues will be that the High Representative also gets a real political deputy, because the situation right now is rather difficult to maintain. But now in the terms of European development, I think we just have to remind ourselves very quickly that we successfully imported the subprime crisis from the United States. It fell on very fertile ground, unfortunately, here in Europe. The bailout of the banks, we created quite a debt problem. Then it spilled over into the euro crisis. You are aware of Greece. The last weekend we had Cyprus, and that had again repercussions on Asia, because there was a summit planned between Japan and the European Union, and President Barroso and President Van Rompuy had to cut the trip, and we had to postpone the summit. That happened already for the second time. We already had once to postpone a summit with China. There was a catch-up summit later on. But all these elements, of course, give the international community, give our Asian friends the impression that the Europeans are concentrating very much on Europe, that we don't have the capacity to look abroad, and that we don't have the capacity to deal with 2 or 3 issues at the same time. Also, the European Union understands itself to be a sort of champion of multilateralism, that we are a sort of model for Europe, for integration in general. All that, of course, got a serious beating through the crisis, because also when you continue to have one crisis meeting after the other, and you don't solve the problem, this is not projecting the image that you are a reliable partner who is ready to play an important role in world politics, especially in areas far apart as Asia. There's no point in denying that. This is a problem, this is a challenge which we have, and we will have to deal with it rather urgently. Because we see also in Europe that we have new fault lines which have opened. We have the deficit countries, the debtors. We have those who are in the Eurozone and those outside the Eurozone. We have those in Central and Eastern Europe and those in Southern Europe. So we get a lot of tension within the European Union, which is difficult for one of the cherished principles of the European Union, which is solidarity. All the discussions you see nowadays, the solidarity is decreasing. There is talk that one model, the German model, is exported all over Europe. We know that the situation in France, the economic situation in France, the financial situation in France is not very good. And if then also the relationship between France and Germany, a sort of engine for European growth, is getting into problems, then we will even have more problems to project ourselves as a viable partner internationally. But I think we also have to see that we are taking some initiatives which hopefully will help us a little bit in the manner of the famous Baron Münchhausen to pull ourselves out of the problems. And one of these initiatives which we have started very recently is that we have announced that we want to conclude a transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the United States, a sort of enlarged free trade agreement between Europe and the most important partner and ally, the United States. What does that have to do with Asia? Well, a lot, because we have to see a little bit the relationship as a triangle. We have the transatlantic relationship between Europe and the United States. We have the relationship over the Pacific between the United States and Asia, and then we have this leg between Europe and Asia. Traditionally, this leg between Europe and Asia has been the weakest in that triangle, and we have created back in 1996 the Asia-Europe meeting, ASEM, where the regions meet in a dialogue process of equal partners. This we have tried to develop, and we have changed policies because in the WTO, the so-called Doha Development Round, didn't make any progress. The multilateral system is under duress, and therefore we have started, like other partners, to enter into free trade negotiations with Asian countries. That's a complete change. As long as I was in Japan from 2002 to 2006, we were under strict instruction from Commissioner Lamy at the time. Don't even think about a free trade agreement. It's multilateralism, it's WTO, it's multilateralism, and let the others do whatever they want to do, but we do it differently. Well, as it didn't work, we have now started also to enter into free trade agreements. We have concluded the most ambitious free trade agreement ever concluded with the Republic of Korea, which is now under implementation. We have finished a few weeks ago a free trade agreement with with Singapore, which is the first agreement with an ASEAN country. We have as a goal to conclude a free trade agreement between all ASEAN and the European Union. We started, but ASEAN was too weak a partner to negotiate as a group, so therefore we had to go back to the bilateral route. So Singapore is concluded, Vietnam and Malaysia under negotiations with good progress. We are negotiating with India, and if everything works out and if we don't get an additional problem now because of the problem of the Italian Marines, which have finally come back to India for trial, then we might be able to conclude by the end of the year a free trade agreement with India. China so far has been reluctant to enter into a free trade agreement, and we have not taken the decision yet whether we really want a free trade agreement with China, but we want an investment agreement with China. But now we can use the announcement that we will negotiate with the United States in the transatlantic dimension also as a leverage vis-à-vis China, because they want not to be left out of the game. This the more as we will start now to negotiate with Japan a similar agreement like we have with Korea. The summit, which was cancelled and was replaced by telephone calls between the three presidents, announced officially the starting of negotiations with Japan. So we get into this network of free trade agreements, which we try also to back up with so-called framework agreements, which are rules and regulations of a binding nature, which also have as an important element that we would like to see that good governance and human rights are respected. This is of course quite a challenge to get it accepted. When the European Union presented the blueprint of such an agreement for the first time to Korea, they said, well, this is not for us, human rights, we are on the good side. When we presented it to the Canadians, they clearly said, you got it wrong, please bring us another blueprint. When we showed it to the Australians, same reactions, Japanese, similar reactions. So there we are in a sort of uphill battle. We succeeded with Korea, therefore we concluded, and with the argument that we have, especially with like-minded countries, among like-minded countries, we have to be able to set standards, to set an international standard, so that other countries can be measured against that standard, and therefore we would like to get these agreements with human rights clauses, with good governance clauses, with rule of law clauses accepted. That's also one of the things the European Parliament would very much like to see. And we have to take that into consideration, because one of the results of the Treaty of Lisbon is that each and every treaty the European Union concludes with an partner, also has to be ratified by the European Parliament, which is a new development, which gives the European Parliament more power, but also more responsibility. Now, I think what we should also have in mind that despite the problems which I have already said and before we all turn into pessimists, there are still some good news which I would also bring to the fore. Despite all these problems, the European Union remains the largest economy in the world. And despite these very slow growth rates, in 2012, the European Union is a 13 trillion economy, which is larger than the United States. That's 11.5 trillion. And then next is China with 5.5 trillion, followed by Japan by 2.7 trillion. So you see there the United States and Europe plays in a separate league compared to all the others. When you look at the competitiveness index, which is published by the World Economic Forum, then among the 10 top countries, you have 5 member states of the European Union. So there is still hope. We don't have to commit suicide yet, but I think we will have to continue working. Now, let me turn now finally to Asia and walk you a little bit through some of the elements. What is true that while Europe was in this crisis mood, Asia in general managed to decouple a little bit from the crisis. Countries like China, India, Singapore and Taiwan managed to maintain double-digit growth rates. And therefore it was not really as a surprise that the Pacific century was again on the horizon. The then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, declared that the next century will be the Pacific century, that she is willing and she will work, that this will become an American century. So that was, of course, a sort of alarming signal for the Asian countries, but it was also a wake-up call for Europe, because we cannot stay behind if the United States is concentrating all its efforts on Asia. In the political slang, that is called the US pivot, or rebalancing to Asia. That was announced very forcefully at the time by President Obama at the summit meeting, the APEC summit meeting, which he had in Honolulu, because he wanted also to play a little bit on his origins. Then he traveled on to Australia. He gave a speech at the Parliament in Australia and announced there that the United States has agreed with Australia to have 2,500 additional troops in Australia, and that he wants to create what he called a seamless market in the Asia-Pacific, having in mind that the United States needs jobs, and we all know already from election campaigns, it's the economy stupid, and that's exactly what he wanted to do. But in the presentation, it came across as a very militaristic move. And many Asian countries, first and foremost China, of course, had the impression that what the United States is actually trying to do is to encircle, to contain the country. Now the United States is trying to do a little bit of rebalancing the rebalancing, so rebalancing the pivot, in trying to explain that it was not only military but also economic, but also trade, and they also want to engage with people, with civil society. That's, by the way, one of the advantages which we have. We are committed to cooperate with the United States, but I don't have to explain to any Asians that our interest in Asia is not military. We are playing in a different league. We are playing on non-traditional security issues like like fighting crime, cyber security, disaster preparedness. These are the issues where we are coming in. And we also, despite what I said at the beginning, that we have taken some beating on our credibility as an integration model, we are working especially with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is trying to follow our example and is adding one step in integration after the other, with one big difference. ASEANs, or the Asians in general, they don't like that the pooling of sovereignty, so they want to maintain what we have in foreign policy, that you can only take decisions if you agree by unanimity. Now, what Asia has to overcome as problems, I think, are in various categories, and I have a division between economic threats and challenges and political ones. Let me start perhaps first with the economic ones. What we see in Asia is that Asia has a very sophisticated web of transnational production networks. However, they don't have integrated market comparable to the internal market of the European Union. And that also has the effect when the Asian countries do free trade agreements amongst themselves, they are what we call rather shallow, so they don't have this high degree of integration which we are aiming at, and that has the effect that they are not trade creating in the same manner as we can achieve. So the present level of trade is maintained, but the trade creation effect is much smaller. For Asian countries, one of the challenges also is to overcome this lack of diversified markets. Nearly all the Asian markets are depending on exports. And depending on exports means they are depending on the US market and on the European market. So when the US and Europe go in crisis, and go in crisis at the same time, then they have to take that situation, and it's very difficult for them to come up with another solution in the short run. In the long run, the challenge for them is to change the system and to have more domestic growth. If you have domestic growth, you create domestic demand, and the economy becomes much more resilient against threats from outside. But in order to do that, and just let's take China as an example, you need quite a thorough reform process in the country. Because what are the main reasons why it is so difficult in China to get the domestic economy, except for a small strata of rich people going, is that there is no real social security system. So each and every Chinese has to put aside quite some money for retirement. They also have to put aside quite some money to finance the education of their children. And then comes the situation that they don't really trust the majority of the state-owned banks, because nobody knows how reliable they are. And experts are pretty convinced that most of the Chinese banks, state-owned banks, would not be able to stand any of the stress tests we have to do in Europe or in the United States, because in the past, and it's still ongoing to a certain degree, it is political decisions by the party who tell the banks that they have to finance certain projects, and it's not based on a solid calculation whether the project is viable or not. And if you don't trust the banks and you keep the money more or less at home, then the money does not enter into the economic cycle and cannot be used to finance expenditure. So this is one of the big challenges in countries like in China, but also in smaller countries like in Vietnam. In order to get out of this dependence also on foreign markets, we have seen some political activities now in Asia You might be familiar with the so-called Chiang Mai initiative, where Asians have tried, after the Asian financial crisis at the end of the 90s, to create a sort of international or an Asian monetary fund in competition with the International Monetary Fund, which is seen as a Western institution. At the time, that was blocked by a veto by the United States and also by Japan. But now, while we talk, there is a BRICS summit in South Africa, and one of the big issues which is on the agenda of the BRICS means it's Brazil, India, China, Russia, and South Africa. They have as a project to create a new international bank. And this is, for the first time, a more concentrated efforts by the newcomers, by the emerging markets, to take their own, trying to take their destiny in their own hands and challenge the system as it was brought up by the West. The Bretton Woods systems, the World Bank, the IMF, is seen too much to play in the interest of Western countries. Despite the fact that there have been some, I must say, probably cosmetical changes in the voting, China still has a very small portion of voting rights in the IMF as well as in the World Bank, and therefore they are trying now to move forward through the BRICS, but also they were instrumental to enlarging what we had as a G7, as a G8 to a G20, where these new countries now meet at par with the old representatives of the West. So there we see some interesting developments. The process so far has been rather slow, but we have learned, especially in the field of finance, that things can move very quickly. One of the reasons why another means of international finance is in the interest of the emerging countries is that they also have a problem of indebtedness. As we talk always about debt, we have perhaps the impression that the only continent, the only countries which are in debt are European countries. Well, Japan, for example, has an indebtedness of 200% of its GDP. The big advantage of Japan is that about 95% of the debt is held by the Japanese themselves. Otherwise, with 200% indebtedness, you would be bankrupt. Take the United States. The United States has a rate of indebtedness of 103% of its GDP, i.e. about 16 trillion US dollars. They can still profit from the fact that the dollar is held as a reserve currency worldwide, but the situation of indebtedness, also compared now with our member states, is quite interesting, because you hardly have, except our problem children like Greece or Italy or Cyprus, nobody is above 100%. That's a privilege for the United States, and it's also a rather unique situation that from time to time the United States is moving to what they call the fiscal cliff, because the White House and the Capitol cannot talk to each other. So that's also a threat. There's no point in saying they also have a problem, because if the United States goes into recession, then we would suffer together with our Asian partners. But that's also something we shouldn't forget. We don't know exactly what the situation is in China. We don't know what is the indebtedness of China as a country. We don't know what is the indebtedness of the different regions. We don't know what is the indebtedness of the big cities, and not to mention the state-owned companies. So there is also a risk which we have to take into account. Also, despite the fact that we talk about the catching up of the East, one should not forget that Asia is still home to the largest number of persons living on $1.25 $100 a day. Despite the fact that millions have been moved up to the middle income class, like in China, in India and Malaysia, but nevertheless absolute poverty and with the related health and sanitary problems is still Asia, unfortunately, leading. That also led the Asian Development Bank in its report from about Asia 2050 to warn that, I quote, increasing inequality could undermine social cohesion and stability in the countries. And this is one of the issues which we overlook. Normally we would attribute that the highest portion of people living below or with $1.25 a day would be in Africa, but still it is in Asia. Then we also have to see that these GDP increases, which are quite impressive, 10% for 30 years nearly in China, but also in other countries, have created quite some problems, especially in the area of the environment and of the people. It has also created, if you take China again, a lot of tension within the country, because you have the discrepancy that the wealth is more or less concentrated on the coast, and you have within the country a very uneven distribution of income, which we have in all society, but in China it is especially pronounced, as well as in other countries like Vietnam or the Philippines, that the top 2% dominate about 60 or 70% of the economy. This environment, especially the environmental neglect for the environment in general, but also for climate change, is one of the issues which we are now discussing in the so-called Millennium Goals, which have to be reached. And also it was one of the red lines which we had in climate change negotiations. You remember the big conference in Copenhagen, where the European Union has tried more or less to push or force countries into a legally binding agreement, which was a failure. It was also a disaster from the negotiating technique, because if you tell everybody what you want, and this is your red line from the beginning, and the others don't want, then you maneuver yourself out of the negotiating process. And that was exactly what happened. I think many of you might have seen the picture that the Obama, the Chinese Prime Minister, the President from Brazil, and the Prime Minister of India were sitting in a separate room and talking, and the European President just by chance opened the door and saw all these guys sitting here and said, well, may I join? But the Asian countries still have to do some work, but on the other hand, we have to recognize that they also have a right to development. But of course, they cannot do it in the same way we have done it in the last 300 or 200 years, not taking care of the environment. And now this transfer of technology or transfer of money, especially money transfers in time of austerity, this is creating a circle, and therefore we are moving very, very slowly in the area of climate change. However, the costs are quite considerable. A World Bank report in 2007 figured out that the loss for the Chinese economy is $100 billion a year because of costs related to environmental damages. So this is money which could be brought to a more productive work. Then we have also in Asia a demographic risk. And there we have a very, very interesting situation, because we have countries which are aging. Japan is the #1 example. That was the first industrialized society which declined. Over about 10 years, they lost nearly 10 million people. So that's more than one of a middle-sized European country. And within 20 years, China will be exactly the same situation. And there is, because of the one-child policy, the pyramid will be exactly the same by 2030 as it is in Europe. And therefore China risks becoming old before it is becoming rich. That's something they will have to handle. On the other hand, we have very young societies. Take India, where 70% of the population is below 20. So this is, for India, one of the main reasons that they will have a big advantage in their competition with China. The demography is playing in favor of India, and another extremely young country, for example, is the Philippines. Now let me turn a little bit to the political part of it and start again with China, because despite this international rise on the international scene, the income distribution, as I have already mentioned shortly, has become extremely unequal. And what is also interesting, when you compare China on a per capita basis, and I think that this is probably the criteria which tells you more than the total size of the economy. So if measured per capita, in nominal terms, China holds only the position 88 worldwide. In terms of purchasing power parity, China is number 92. That puts China more or less at the same level as Bulgaria and Romania, which hold the position 63 and 73 respectively. So you see, there is a certain balancing. One of the challenges for the leadership in China, of course, also is to find the means to advance reform in a way that people have the possibility to express their desires in a non-violent way. We get now more and more reports about China that there are social unrest because of the environment, because people lose their houses, they are forced to move because of industrial projects. And if you don't have a democratic structure, or where you can express your discontent, well, the only thing which is left is violence. And finding a safety valve is one of the challenges of the leadership, which is recognized if you look a little bit at the social media in China, the reports we get there in translation. This is a coming issue which is nearly as important as corruption. Well, we should not only talk about China all the time. There are challenges for many other countries. Take Indonesia. Indonesia has managed a transition to democracy, but at the same time, this is a country with 18,000 islands. And 18,000 islands, the majority of them is not controlled by the state, and it's very difficult to develop them. Think of the Philippines. The Philippines is still lagging behind if you make a comparison of all the other ASEAN countries, and they have this difficulty of ethnic and religious tensions. Mindanao is an ongoing problem, which also translates into organized crime. Laos and Cambodia, well, two underdeveloped countries, very much influenced by China, economically, but also politically. We have seen that recently when Cambodia had the chairmanship, the presidency of ASEAN. The ASEAN, for the first time in the long history of 45 years, was not able to agree on a ministerial declaration at the end of ministerial meetings, because China made sure that there was no mentioning of the territorial problems in that declaration, which was contested by the other countries, by the Vietnamese, by the Philippines, who have that problem with China. Singapore, an autocratic system which is functioning quite well, but also there last election the government got a yellow card, because for the first time the opposition got 40% of the votes, but because of the electoral system they only got 6 out of the 87 seats in the parliament. But there is also some tension, and we know from studies of historians, but also political scientists, in the long run, it has never worked to have this separation between politics and economy. Nevertheless, the situation in most of the countries can be improved, to say the least. The same applies to death penalty. China is the world leader in executions. We don't know exactly how many, but about 5,000 to 6,000 a year, which puts it on the forefront. The other countries where we have executions is North Korea. Again, we don't know exactly how many. Also in Bangladesh, and unfortunately also in Japan. Not to forget the United States. The United States also in 2010 executed 46 prisoners. Immigration. Well, immigration is always an indicator that people move because they want to find a better life. There you see a movement out of China, out of the Philippines to other Asian countries, especially Japan, which is not very accommodating for immigration. They accept to a certain degree workers, but not immigration. And for the rest, you have a very strong pressure on Europe, but also on the United States. Whereas, even now that we are in crisis, you don't have a very strong pressure of Europeans or Americans who all want to emigrate to China, to Vietnam, or whatever. These are always minorities. So, as an indicator where people want to go, people want to come to Europe, want to come to the United States, and not vice versa. Now, if I turn now to the overall political system, just a few words, because that's also something which is overlooked and which we hear now once in a while because of the territorial disputes and maritime disputes of China with Japan, with the Philippines, with Vietnam, with Thailand, where we have rather precarious situations around these islands. You have sometimes 40 to 50 boats. You have fisher boats, you have boats from the Coast Guard, you have military vessels, and it's very easy that something happens, even if it's an accident. But these accidents, they can get out of control very easily. So therefore, we are very much concerned about the security situation linked to these territorial claims. We also have a divided Korean Peninsula. This is the situation which we have overcome in Europe, but it's the Cold War situation, a divided country, like we had in Germany. We don't know exactly what the development in North Korea will be. We don't know now if this young leader has the ability of his father and his grandfather to know when is the moment that he has to do a deal, because they always knew it, and so this is a precarious situation. They are developing missiles, they are developing nuclear weapons, but it's the only negotiating chip which they have, and I must say they are very able diplomats. They are selling the only thing which they have all over again, but it's certainly a risk. It's perhaps also not so well known that there is no peace treaty between Russia and Japan, because they still have a problem about the Kuril Islands. So that this is another threat in the region. We have the unsolved problem of Taiwan in the Straits, which is guaranteed by the United States. This has become now a sort of dormant conflict. However, the strategy which is developed by China right now, what we call the Nine Pearl Strings line, has as a goal to advance control by China and to delay the access of the American Navy to areas close to China, and that's meant primarily to make sure that Taiwan is not fully protected by the United States through the Navy. This also translates in a sort of arms race, especially in the navies. A lot of money is invested. China just bought and built the first aircraft carrier. They don't have yet the planes, but they have the carrier, but that will come in due course. But they are investing a lot of money in submarines, and especially when you invest in submarines, then you want to challenge that boats can pass freely in coastal areas. So these are just a few of the highlights, which are also due to the fact that, contrary to Europe, in Asia we don't have a security system. In Europe we have the European Union, we have the Council of Europe, we have the OSCE, which are either a legal framework which allows conflict resolution, or like the OSCE, it is a political framework. But this is something which is lacking in Asia, and which gives rise to considerable concern, not only in Europe but also in the United States. Well, these were just a few of the elements, and I will stop here. Just without having rosy glasses and saying, well, everything is fine in Europe, I think we also have to see that there are considerable risks, challenges also on the Asian side, and therefore I've chosen the title East Meets West Reloaded. You all know the famous saying of Kipling: East is East, West is West, and never the twain shall meet. Well, that was at his time. I hope I could demonstrate to you that we have, in this globalized world, an interconnection, if we take it in the area of politics, of economics and security. So the reloaded version is interconnectivity, and we have to live with that. Thank you very much.